Made it clear, the central banks and the government, that they want everybody to take a shot to the face. They want demand to go down. And I think that's already happening quite fast.
Demand for what?
Stuff. So if they put up your mortgage rates, you spend less in restaurants. If you're finding your food bills at the supermarket 30% higher than they were, you spend less on something else. The price of goods moves either because there's not enough supply, which is what we've had a problem with, or it's because there's too much or not enough demand. So if you've got something with restricted supply, so let's think of oil right now. Because of the Russian situation, there is not enough oil for the current demand out there. So the oil price keeps going up. So you and I pay more to drive our cars or to heat or cool our houses. The only way of solving that one, because you can't get the Russian oil back into the market, is to make us use less oil. The price does that automatically because it gets more expensive we do it. But if you can also then just lower general demand for things, we'll drive our cars less, we'll catch less flights, all of that stuff, and that lowers demand and therefore prices. Because prices rising, inflation, is evil for our savings because the dollar in your bank account is worth less in a year's time. It's currently worth 8% less, which is quite a lot. It's this weird situation where we have to take the pain. We're told we can't buy as much and we're forced into it by rising our mortgage costs and our food costs and all of this stuff. And eventually things will slow down, people will be put out of jobs a bit, and then the overall demand in the economy comes down and prices come down. We're all collectively taking the pain for this inflation that was created out of a whole bunch of different things, from the pandemic, through to supply chain issues, through to underinvestment in commodities, through to the shift to green energy. All of these things have created this moment in time, which is tricky. So the Fed can engineer it by trying to raise interest rates, and it filters through to our mortgages and other stuff. Or the market kind of clears of its own accord, where prices get too much, people stop buying stuff, prices fall back again. So either way tends to work, and we're in this weird mess where the Federal Reserve are doing it, the markets are doing it, and we're having to take all the pain in the meantime. I generally think that the market is better at doing it. If you actually see it, from my perspective, somebody who closely follows interest rate markets and stuff like that, they did all of the tightening anyway, well before the Fed. People you hear the expression, the Fed are behind the curve. What it means is the bond market's already priced it. Interest rates need to go up to slow down the economy because there's too much inflation, and the Federal Reserve are trying to catch up. I actually think the markets do a pretty decent job. Prices rise, eventually it gets too expensive, we stop doing it. Now, there's different equations that people fear is when it becomes super entrenched in the economy and we all go to our bosses and go, I want a pay rise, and everybody does that at the same time. That pushes up prices further, you get more wage rises, and that's a wage price spiral. That really has only happened in the US really once, which was in the late 70s, early 80s, when all of the baby boomers hit kind of 30 years old at the same time. So if you think when you go back to 30, you're kind of settling down with somebody, you're probably thinking about buying a house, you're buying a car, you've got a job, you're starting to earn some money. We had the largest group of people in all history turning 30 at the same time. And they all did the same thing and bought the same stuff, and that really pushed up prices. And that was at the same time there was issues with oil supply and other things. So we had this double whammy of a demand shock and a supply shock, which meant prices went crazy. But that's really only happened once. My view, and it still remains, even though it seems pretty unfashionable right now with inflation, as prices go up, the economy slows down. The exact mechanism, and therefore it becomes self-regulating. And it becomes that because people are quite in debt, and it's a very old population in the US and Europe and elsewhere. So if you raise prices on your retired parents, they can't earn more money because they've got their pension, and that's it. So what happens is they end up buying less, and there's a big cohort of people. So that's why I think it automatically over time kind of self-corrects. But the other mechanism is the bond market, which is a fancy name for saying interest rates, the price that you and I and companies and governments can borrow. So if it becomes more expensive to borrow, so think of your mortgage, if you've got a mortgage, well then if it becomes more expensive to borrow, then you spend less. So the interest rate market forces demand to come lower. Now, let's say you don't have a mortgage and you're a renter. Well, the person you rent from has a mortgage, so they will raise your rent because of it, which is why everybody's feeling this pain now, feeling a bit poorer. And that's the issue that's here. However, they have one more other thing in their arsenal.
The U.S. debt crisis could ignite a long-term rally in gold. Since March 2020, the U.S. added another $8 trillion in debt, and gold is up 50%. Buying gold and silver is a defensive strategy when you don't trust elected officials in Washington, D.C. having your best interest at heart. National Gold Group is America's #1 precious metals company. National Gold Group has the IRA fee waiver program. That means they will pay the fees on your IRA for up to 10 years on qualifying rollovers. Call 888-599-2883 to learn about their retirement account fee waiver program. Mention free investing, and you'll always get best-in-class service from America's conservative precious metals leader. You can also go to their website, buyfigold.com, using the link in this video description.
However, they have one more other thing in their arsenal, and that is balance sheet, printing money or taking money out of the economy. And they have been printing money for a long time to offset the pandemic and the extra borrowing that was required, i.e., when they print money, they're buying the bonds of the government. So the Federal Reserve are buying the bonds of the government. So it allows the government to borrow more without causing any problems. Right now, they're about to start tightening, quantitative tightening. People hear the terminology. And what that basically is a fancy word for we're going to take some money out of the economy. If they stop quantitative easing, which is the first step, which they've done, that's not putting any money in, extra money in. When they do quantitative tightening, they take money out. So if there's a big pool of money sitting there, and they say, listen, we're going to take 5% of that out every year, less money around, they sell the bonds that's on their balance sheet. So they have trillions of dollars of this stuff sitting around where they've stimulated the economy. And then what they do is push it back into the economy. And the idea is it pushes up wages, or all the banks have to buy these bonds now from the government. And so then they buy these bonds and they've got less money left to lend and do other activities with. It is weird, but if you break it down to the human element, I'm going to lend you money when I've got plenty of it. And if you're desperately in need of it, because you're going through hard times, you'll pay anything for it. And if you kind of would like to borrow some money but aren't desperate, you'll pay a lower rate. It's basically as simple as that. You know, the transaction between two people is the same thing. So if a mate of yours comes to you and you know they're a terrible creditor, but he's a friend, you're going to have to set an interest rate that maybe to make sure that you get compensated for the risk you're taking. And if you don't have much money because you're feeling a bit tight yourself, you're either not going to lend it to him or charge a bit more money because you could have used that money for something else. Leverage allows you to borrow future money to use now. So at two levels, humans are terrible. We just want everything now. We don't want to work for it. If I can borrow it and buy that Rolex watch or my new car, right? We're trying to meet our future expectations of ourselves always. That's what drives humans. So that's why they use leverage. And it's the same with investments. So they do it for purchasing power, to bring that future expectations of themselves. Have I earned enough money to buy that car? No, but if I borrow money, I can get my future self here. It's kind of a trade-off because you're actually in debt and now owe somebody. You don't actually own the car. You own the ability to use the car until you pay that off. It's the same with a house, really. And the other point is for investments. You know, people love to borrow money now because then you can make a bigger investment now. But the trade-off is what happens if that goes wrong? Then before you know, you get a margin call or liquidated. And you know, that's a feature we see a lot in the crypto markets, for example. It happens kind of automatically. Humans just love this stuff because it brings their future expectations of themselves closer. I could be richer, I could have more stuff than I deserve now from my income. You can get in trouble if you can't pay your interest. So let's say the economy slows down and you lose your job. Now what seemed like a reasonable payment suddenly becomes impossible. And then you're in arrears, and then you get the little tap on your shoulder, which is like, I'd like that house back now. Because you don't own that house. We, the bank, do. This is what people don't understand with leverage. You don't own that thing. You only own it when you pay it off. So that's what happens when you lose your job, you then can't afford to pay your mortgage payments. Now, there's a difference between the US and Europe for this. So the US, you give the keys back to the bank. It's not the end of the world. In Europe, the debt stays with you.
Oh, God.
Yeah, it's very different.
They get the house back and you still owe the debt?
Correct, because the house is valued less, particularly when what you get, we refer to as negative equity. You buy a house for 300 grand and it's now worth 200 grand, you owe the bank 100 grand. Now, it's okay if you can still make the payments and eventually you just pay off the mortgage. At the moment you can't, they're like, well, you owe us 100 grand, and they take you to court. And you carry that and you go to bankruptcy.
So we know we're going to take a kick to the face, but you've got the Baron Rothschild quote. So what everybody knows is buy when there's blood in the streets. But the original quote supposedly was buy when there's blood in the streets, even if the blood is your own. So there's going to be a moment where everybody else is going to panic. We're living in that moment right now. People are freaking out. The euphoria that we had 6 months ago has transitioned into a sort of cynical, fearful thing. Now people are not necessarily looking for opportunities, and that may cause them to miss a tremendous moment. It would seem to me that what you have to understand is the macro market, what is going on. We are certainly in interesting times right now. So we've got whatever economic crisis is going on in China. They are locking down now again because they have a zero COVID policy. We've got war going on in Europe. We have potentially a global recession headed our way. We certainly have inflation. Maybe there's things we can do to fix it. Paint this macro picture for us. Explain to me the debt angle and how they stop it from imploding.
Debt at economic level happens 4 different places. One is governments. It's called the deficit. You hear this terminology. It's basically how much the government borrows. They'll borrow from people, foreign entities, corporations, anybody who wants that rate of interest that they will give them for it. So you have the US government, you have the US households, individuals, us. You have corporations, and you have the financial system. Those 4 combined are about 300 and something percent of GDP. GDP is the amount of activity in the economy every year in dollar terms, and they've borrowed an extraordinary amount. This is the most indebted the US has ever been. So to put it in perspective, the US is about 25% of the global economy, yet they have 100% equivalent of global GDP in debt. So this is the most indebted economy in the history of world economics in terms of global debt, because it's so big. Now, the US is not the only one here. Europe's got massive debts, Japan's got massive debts, China's got big debts, everyone's got debts, because we borrowed for our future selves. You know, why get enough tax income for the road system I need to build? Why not just issue more bonds and build it now? Because the bet is I'll create more productivity in the future, and then GDP grows and it's easier to pay off. And that generally works okay. But what happens is when your debt becomes so large and something happens to your income, then you start to say, well, can I pay this debt? So we talked about that part. The other part is everything's backed by collateral. That's the thing that you pledge when you take out debt. Now, if collateral falls too much in value, somebody taps you on the shoulder and says, that stuff you gave us in exchange for the money doesn't cover the money anymore. And then you get this liquidation that we talked about. This can't happen on an economic level. It can happen to you and I, but we can't let it happen systemically, because then everything goes. So we came very close to the edge in the US and Europe in 2008. So much so that the banking system seized up entirely, because the collateral, the house prices, went down. And then the banks were like, oh shit, we don't have enough money against all of this. And then people weren't paying because we're going to recession. That big doom loop happens. In Europe, we got that. But then there was another one in Europe, which was the EU crisis. This time, it wasn't the banks that were in trouble. It was the governments. Italy, Spain, France, Portugal, Greece couldn't pay their debts. And then that was the really holy shit moment, is if whole countries that are part of Europe, these are big, massive nations, can't pay their debts, then we're all fucked. Because then that's the whole banking system gone, that's the whole system of government gone, that's everything gone. So they backstopped the system by saying, we'll do whatever it takes. This was Mario Draghi's famous term. So basically the EU got together and said, we will buy these bonds to stop them falling the price in bankruptcy. Because against government bonds, as we talked about, it's the risk-free rate. Well, if it's not risk-free, then all of the other debt that's borrowed on top of it would have blown up too. That's been the answer since 2008, is to print currency to buy bonds, which is known as currency debasement. And there's many purists in the financial markets that it doesn't work that way, the mechanism, but it's very clear that this is basically monetary debasement. What monetary debasement means for anybody who doesn't understand is, let's say you're thirsty, Tom, I sell you a bottle of water. You want to buy it because you're thirsty, so I can charge you $5 for it. Then let's say I've got 20 bottles of water. Well, it's not that panicky to get that one bottle, so it might clear at $3 for that bottle of water. Now, if I've got 1 million bottles of water, water's worthless, right? So the more you create of something, the less value it has. If there's one Picasso, it's worth a fortune. If Picasso had made 5,000 of exactly the same painting, they're worth less. So we see that with, for example, one-on-ones of Warhol versus Warhol's factory where he produced very similar pieces. They're worth less than the others. So scarcity versus abundance. What you do when you print more money means there's more money around, lowers the value of the money. That's debasing currency. This is why they can't let the system go bust, because now there's so much leverage that everything goes. And we saw this in Argentina, famous moment in Argentina in 2001, I believe it was, called El Corralito, where the Argentinians couldn't pay their bills, the government. So what they did is they had this dual economy, the Argentinian peso and a dollar-based peso. They just took all the dollars from the bank accounts and convert them into pesos. So they got the dollars themselves to pay their debts, but basically utterly destroyed the peso and destroyed the economy. So much so that Argentina reverted to barter. It was an extraordinary moment in time. That's the risk. The other time we saw something similar in a more developed country was Cyprus. Cyprus is a European country. Now, Cyprus, they had a financial crisis. There was too much debt. It was based around property. And so what happens is the banks were insolvent, like they were in the US and like they were in Europe. But the answer was the ECB said, we're not bailing you out. So what they did is took any deposit out of the banking system over 100,000 euros and took it. So it wasn't your money. Even if it's in a bank, it's not your money. These are the laws of unintended consequences that happen if you allow the collateral to go under. If we were less levered, like in India, the country's very unlevered, call it 60% of GDP in debt, in a fast-growing economy, it's growing 10% a year. That's like you taking the mortgage out, and mortgage isn't that big, and you've got great income, right? The probability of you not being able to pay that debt is very low. So it doesn't matter if Indian assets fall a lot and stuff like that, because there's nothing systemic there. You're not going to destroy the population. But when it's the US or Europe, you can't allow it. You just simply can't. Because also, part of this is you've got this huge old population of retired people or people trying to retire. If you allow the market to clear, then their savings pool disappears. We've all gone through parts of our career where we've lost a bunch of money and we make it back. You know, you work hard, but you can't do that when you're 75 years old. What's lost is lost. And then you have to halve your spending because you've just lost half your pool of money and you don't know how long you're going to live for. So this is why there's so much complexity with old populations, lots of debt. You just can't allow the system to go under. It's because when you're able to borrow, because you're the richest dude in the street who earns the most money, which is the United States, and humans have a propensity to borrow to create the image of this future self. The future self was the amazing United States of America, that dream that we had in the 50s. That dream died decades ago. And to fund that dream, the mismatch between the dream and the reality is debt. Sometimes debt is not all bad, right? Sometimes it can help accelerate some of the things. But if you're doing it to fund a dream that's never going to exist, that's the danger. So let's talk about it in financial market terms or macro terms. I think there's three things you need to do here. One, income. Income rules the world. Income pays your bills. Income can pay your mortgage. Income does everything. Without income, you got nothing. Income takes hard work. It's hard to get up the ladder, earn more income. Secondly, is you need to have optionality. You need to have things that can pay off. A startup or a hobby business on the side can give you optionality because you can build a business and a business has intrinsic value, plus it can increase your income. So focus on your income, work hard, look for other opportunities that can leverage that income and opportunity set that you've got for you. And then thirdly is if I've got this income, look for investment opportunities that can change my life. And that doesn't mean being a degenerate gambler. Simply put, if there is a thesis, for example, this is a long-term and highly volatile, you should be looking at the moments of extreme weakness, the blood on the streets moment, to be buying more. Not on leverage, but just putting your money into it. So if you'd have bought a house after the 2008 crisis, you'd have done very well. If you'd have bought it at the peak, you'll have done less well, right? So timing matters. So what we should be doing is using this, thinking of the money you've put in as your retirement money and writing it off. And then just adding, if you've got money in a bear market. Now, the problem is most of us don't in a recession. But a friend of mine taught me very early on, he said, Raoul, there's a key thing I've learned is he who has cash in a recession is king. So that's that combination of income and opportunity. You've got income, you've got some cash, and now everything's on fire sale prices. You're the king. There's a lot of macro similarities with the past episodes, and everybody makes it very dramatic. There tends to be a lot of doom porn. You know, everything looks like the 1929 crash, everything looks like we're going to go to World War II, everything looks like it's 2001 all over again. Yes, those things happen, but things go on. And if you bought tech stocks after 2001 crash, you'd be very, very wealthy indeed. If you think of Jeff Bezos, he launched Amazon, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, has his IPO, it explodes in price, everyone's like, oh amazing, an online bookseller. It then falls 96%. And then what happened is, well, unlike most of his investors, he held on. And it went up a lot again, still didn't make up the high, it fell another 80%, it went up again, it then fell 60%, and then before you know it, this online bookseller was suddenly worth more than all the bookselling companies in the world added together, and it was still trading at a price-earnings ratio of like 800. Everyone's like, this is crazy, this is a bubble. What we didn't realize is he was building a network, this network for e-commerce, and then the computing power that drives it. And so over time, Amazon just did that. And these are the things you need to think about in this is, where are we in the volatility and is this going to survive? Those are the two questions. And if the long-term trend is there, then you should be buying into all of this.
National Gold Group is Consumer Affairs' top-rated gold IRA dealer. Call 888-599-2883.